Well, over here. Yeah, yeah. You're gonna love it. It's gonna be really fun. Sure. I learned a lot. What'd you say? Friday. At 7:30. Do you guys leave Friday? What time? Oh, God. Do you guys practice that day too when you get there? Oh. Kind of nice. What time is the game on Saturday? It's a nice campus. I like that. I like playing there. Our gym is so nice. But I'm pretty sure they're trying to go D2. Like they're trying to turn into a D2 school. Yeah. You like what? Are you done this year? No. Fifth year? Oh. Wait, how many years do you have left? What? On that. Yeah, we usually take a breakout too.
Okay, let's get going. So we have a couple guests here today who are here as part of the Uni 101 and are just observing. So if you haven't already, please give them a welcome. They're just learning a little bit more about some of these courses here at EOU. So as we kind of talked about, communication and social change is an upper division course here at EOU, focused on how communication is happening to advocate across a variety of social and political issues, the role of rhetoric and persuasion, and so on. Let's do a quick recap. Last class, we talked about this idea of consumatory rhetoric. So when we look at a lot of movements, right, many of these movements are discussed in terms of how these social movements are able to advocate for their own terms, right? So the idea of just doing a protest or demonstration or form of activism is communication that is achieving its objective, right? That for many indigenous activists in the context of the Red Power movement in the United States, the focus was not necessarily about winning over white people or white policymakers, but rather focusing on how to develop a sense of tradition, of identity, of camaraderie, that for many indigenous populations has generationally been incredibly important to cultivate. In fact, many of the indigenous groups here in the region are ones that are focused on developing language programs and building connections between communities, particularly in educating the youth about language and culture. So sometimes movements are simply about creating a sense of shared identity that exists internally within those movements. So as we're thinking about and understanding the role of communication, right, we might be thinking about the ways in which rhetoric has a lot of power to create our senses of identity. How do we know who we are? Well, we use communication to fill in those gaps and to understand our role in society relative to other people, right? So the Red Power movement is an example of thinking about how Indigenous activism specifically and communication more broadly can create a sense of shared identity and experience that exists across a variety of different cultures. So for today, we're going to be taking a look at some of the elements of performance, what it means to engage in performance through communication. And in particular, we're going to be looking at this idea of enclaves or protected communities or groups that are able to communicate for social and political change on issues that they're interested in, and about how these smaller enclaves and groups are able to interact in a way that's very different than what we might see in terms of broader, more public actors. I apologize if I'm a little loopy today. Because I'm a nerd, I spent last night staying up really late watching the results from the 2022 midterm elections. Number of reports and updates that have happened today as well, including the governor's race that was recently called, right? In this class, the goal is not to suggest or convey a particular political agenda or set of beliefs. However, I think there are a lot of dynamics of social change communication that are at play if we look both nationally and locally in terms of strategies that worked, strategies that didn't, and the ways in which campaigns, movement, change, candidates, and so on were fashioned around a lot of these principles and ideas that we've been talking about over the course of the class. One recurring theme that came up in results and exit polling from the midterms were that the two biggest issues for people were topics of inflation and the economy, as well as abortion, right? And so when we looked at the ways that candidates were framing and talking about those issues, it was often in the context of those topics being framed and the impacts of those topics in candidates and their positions on those issues. Think about it in terms of locality and demographics. Think about this in terms of the strategies that candidates use. You can also think about it in terms of issue selection and topics within the state, right? The topic of homelessness and houselessness has been an incredibly salient one in the state of Oregon, particularly in the Portland area, right? And there have been a lot of ways that candidates have devised strategies and activism surrounding positions on some of those issues, right? So I think it's just, there's a lot to probably unpack and to look at, right? And a lot that will probably continue to connect as we're looking through some things. I'm excited because I'm going to be writing a paper about how rhetoric of ableism was used in the context of the Pennsylvania Senate debate. Really excited to get that one going. But anyway, a lot of things for us to look at and unpack. Before we do that, we do have coming up here at the end of the term, the Creating Movement presentation and write-up that I'll be asking you to work on. If you haven't done so already, I have a poll that's on the front page of Canvas where I'm asking you to indicate your preference for some changes to our presentation date and time. The reason for that is just because Oregon Rural Action is hoping to join us in early December in one of those 2 days, either the 5th or the 7th. So we'll just be making some updates to our schedule based around that. So if you haven't done so already, please complete that form. It's just on the front page of Canvas and should be pretty easy to access. And once you've done that, I want you to take some time. You don't need to turn this in for attendance, but I will be asking you to share and report to us about perhaps topics or issues that you see yourself as being interested in to develop for your Creative Movement presentation and reflection. Again, for this project, you do not need to actually go out and do the communication, right? You don't have to actually like become a 501c3 or anything like that. But what I'm asking you to develop is essentially a proposal or framework for how you would communicate and engage on an issue. For instance, you could develop something like a mock poster or social media campaign that you might be using as part of your effort. So you might think about topics or issues that you're interested in. So maybe topics that are built off of things that you've analyzed for your essay in this class, or for your annotated bibliography, topics that you're personally interested in, maybe topics you're already involved in and want to do more with. So I want you to take some time to think about what some of those issues might look like that you're interested in exploring, considering the ways that this movement might communicate, right? So what would this movement do? And then lastly, we've been talking a lot in this class about different strategies and ways that movements work. What would you be doing? And how would you see the strategies you would use as part of this movement as effective? So I want to give you the chance to brainstorm for a bit of time, and I'll ask us to go around and share some of the things that you all are coming up with, and then we'll build on that and go from there. You have about 5 or so more minutes here. A couple more minutes and I'll ask people to share shortly. Okay, so at this point, right, you don't need to have a fully developed sense of what you'd like to do. You're welcome to continue to explore ideas and ways of completing. this assignment. I do want to show you, just so that you know what to expect here for the social movement analysis essay. No, that was the last assignment. Sorry about that. Creative movement presentation. So I'll be posting the rubric by the end of the day today, and I'll be updating you on Canvas when I have that up. But essentially, this assignment has two parts, right? So what you'll be doing is a 5-minute presentation in class in which I'm asking you to share what this movement is, how this movement is communicating, and including some type of visual aids to talk about this movement. So you might make something like a poster or a flyer, or describe the social media that this movement would be using, and so on, right? So you'll be sharing what this movement is and what you're doing. If you want to have us interact with it, you're welcome to make it interactive as well, but that's not required. I will be able to give you a finalized schedule for presentations, but you should expect that the November 30th, December 5th, December 7th range will be the range that presentations will be held. Again, I'll update you as soon as I have a finalized time on that. And in addition to that, once you do that during our last week of class, what we'll be doing is, rather than a final exam, I'll be asking you to complete a 2-page write-up that asks you to reflect on and explain the ways that the design of your movement has connected to some key ideas and aspects of communication and social change. So just like for the analysis essay, we might focus on some major elements of strategy that the movement used. For example, maybe you're really into intersectional rhetoric and how the ways that the combination of visual, verbal, spoken, written came together for the project. Or you might be really interested in coalitions and enclaves, as we're talking about this week, and how you develop a sense of community within your organization. So that gives you a sense of what to expect here. Again, I think it'll be a lot of fun, and it'll be a good chance for us to see what we're doing and apply and really use some of those skills a bit more. So why don't we go around and share, and let's start here on this side. So Nigma, what are you thinking?
Well, from my previous one, I chose gun movements. I wanted to tackle the other one I was talking about, which is the Night-Skins fan-driven social movement. And they already have a common way of communicating through hashtags when they assign it to photos or videos that contain drawings, animations, or cosplays of character with, like, otherwise characters that were drawn with a lighter skin tone, but with like a darker skin tone for self-representation for the dark community. And I could not find a direct connection to the discussions in class, but it is effective for its relation to people's interest, especially for the fans. It is understandable that because they're interested in it, that they can find self-representation within its aspects that assures them a strong connection to the movement.
Yeah. So as I understand it, right, you're interested in kind of examining the ways that animation, and particularly the kind of relationship between the skin color, presentation, and even considering things like, you know, acting, performing, voice acting play a role too. I saw some tweets that were coming out from like voice actors who, there was one that was saying he was not going to return to play a character because he no longer felt comfortable playing voice acting a character of color when the voice actor was white, right? So, you know, there's a lot to focus on there, right? I think that fan-based social movements is a really good starting point, but also looking at coalitions and how a sense of community among fans might be formed. So the social and political implications of representation in those groups seems important too. And you might consider and discuss the ways that you're addressing a gap, right? So maybe there isn't a fully developed movement in some areas, or you'd like to see something new happen or develop. So you might talk about this in the context of a specific show or film or campaign or movement that you're interested in that might build off of the ideas that you're seeing from this group too. So I think you've got good starting point here. And I think connecting it to the stakes, right? Why is this important? Well, media and representation shape reality. What we see projected on media in many ways can reflect and reinforce how we're experiencing things day to day. And issues of media representation are important, are political, or socially driven. I think connecting it to those components will be useful as well as you're working through that. So really cool to hear how that's developing. Christine?
Yeah, so Ryan appointed me after Monday's class discussion.
Mhm.
That I will be on public education for internet culture.
Yeah.
So this will kind of look like if it was here on campus, just like an open public education that can be seen by many and heard by many whoever kind
Yeah.
of walk by and everything. And this kind of ties to class because one, it draws on the human emotion while also drawing on the genres of forensic, epidemic, and deliberative forms of rhetoric because it kind of ties back into what had happened in the past, as well as celebrating the education and the culture of today.
Yeah.
And this can be used through the initial education, like being in a public area,
Mhm.
as well as through image embodiment in written and spoken languages. And it can be effective in communicating as it can tie onto the importance of strong language.
Mhm.
For example, what we did not hear about in history is that the indigenous culture was murdered within Native Americans when General Richard Henry Pratt ordered the English to kill the Indian and save them.
Mm.
So kind of can tie in a different make an effective form of communication by using the other side of history.
Yeah.
For the language.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that is super in-depth. You've got a really great set of not only ideas, but also ways of tackling them, right? And while you're not required to go out and do the thing, like you've got a lot of the resources that might allow you outside of this class to begin to explore that, which is great. You know, I think that talking about Indigenous education and the focus on education, right, I think is a really important strategy, both in developing the kind of internal coalition element, but also in terms of the broader public communication strategy you're already able to point to, right, and really discussing the facts of history and the ways that, you know, history of violence and genocide has been whitewashed is an important component for examining this movement too. So I think that we've got some really concrete and clear approaches, really great ways to explore those. And I think that focusing on that kind of public initiative and education element of it, I think can be a really useful way to point to what communication can do toward what you see as really important for this movement. So that's exciting. Kate.
I was thinking about doing something with the band of books in school library.
Yeah.
Communication, for me at least, I've seen like John Green talk about how frustrated he's been with his books being constantly banned, and it's getting more and more common. So social media, getting more authors to talk about it would be huge, and then also use a space in place, like such as like setting up just like a stand of banned books outside libraries, informing people like why these books shouldn't be banned, like Speak or The Hate You Give, or even like People Are Kissing.
Right.
They're incredibly important books about being an outsider, standing up for yourself, but all three of those books are in one of the top, like 100 most banned books.
Yeah.
Because people just don't agree with what it's saying, or there's too much violence in them.
I mean, if you're looking for the intersection of English and comm, there you go. Yeah, so that's really exciting, and I think a really good topic. Obviously, has had a lot of attention, social and political implications. You know, the focus on like place and space and the intersectional elements of that, I think, are really at play because you not only have the arguments and strategy, like folks like John Green were mentioning, we're pushing back, but the way that like visual spectacle is being used. For instance, maybe there's like a massive bonfire of banned books that are burning. There's almost a Fahrenheit 451 thing, or the like visual display of shelving. I mean, I was at Powell's a couple months ago, and they prominently display banned books, right? And they have a whole shelf with that. You know, they've got like Mouse on there and a few other ones. So, you know, that visual element playing into that as well, I think is a really important component there. So I think thinking about, you know, maybe it's your own display or, you know, getting that argument out there and using those visual elements as part of the argument, I think is a really valuable addition to looking at that too. So that sounds great. Back.
Kind of thinking about doing labor rights,
Uh-huh.
maybe movement for 30-hour work weeks,
Mhm.
even one. And then people like, I mean, I still hear there's some big companies like Amazon that have really bad like internal relations and employee rights. Kind of looking into those topics. But
Mhm.
I haven't really thought too hard about it. That's what I had.
Yeah. So as you're developing that, I think one thing to think about here is who's the target audience, right? So is this you are creating kind of a coalition or shared set of beliefs within a group, kind of like we'll be talking about today, or is your movement more oriented toward directly confronting and kind of making demands toward people in power, right? So I think that's going to shape a lot of the approaches and strategies that are being made here. And the way that the goals sort of are laid out, right? There's a lot of history in labor rights movements in terms of their ability to literally jam and hold up crucial things from happening on the basis of, you know, striking and pushing back, and also just making us aware of conditions and situations, right? So to focus on the lived experience and perspective of people in these roles might be an important element too. For instance, the way that maybe personal narratives and stories about the experience working for some of these companies or organizations and what that means to have to do that kind of work at that level might be an element too. So there's a lot of directions to go, but I think really focusing on audience can help. So let's move over here.
Okay, so I was looking into two things that I'm gonna focus on. One of them is, and it is advocating for higher pay for field workers.
Yeah.
Because of like the work environment that they work in, which is like it can be 100 degrees outside and still be working, and like they're walking really long distance and like bending down too while they're cleaning that, and they can get like blisters as well. And not only that, but they work Monday through Saturday, and they don't have no benefits or anything like that. It's also seasonal. So my only issue would be with that, if they were not to show up to work as a way of protesting to it, it would not only not only fear of losing their job, but they could that same company could also expose their information,
Yeah.
as most of them are immigrants. So some of my solutions would be like creating social media posts and sharing that information out to the public, that and then maybe creating a petition, and as well as using these on-campus resources like Latino Impact, and locating certain companies. And like you mentioned earlier, using insiders and personal people that have had experiences working in the field and been affected by working in the field.
Yeah. Some of the things we'll get into next week, I think, can directly connect as well, because next week we're going to be talking about strategies of control and how like organizations and groups try to stifle movements, right? So it seems like, you know, a lot of the heart of this movement is just the ability to get out information and to make people aware of these conditions and experiences people have, perhaps also to advocate for better protections and support for people who are at a peril for disclosing and sharing that experience that you're talking about. It seems like a large part of the problem is that people are unable to get the word out or to make the broader public aware of what's going on, right? So, you know, a lot of these movements, including those associated with like labor and with workers' rights, are very much about like people not being aware, not knowing, and not having the resources to understand by situating personal experience, narrative, and accounts of what it's like from that perspective, right? And bridging that gap. I think a lot of movements can be really effective at making people aware of just what the heck is going on. So you might be thinking about elements of narrative. Move up here.
So my original essay was on Title IX
Mhm.
and how women's sports aren't broadcasted on like ESPN as much as men's sports.
Mhm.
And I was kind of thinking for this project to do like a moment of absence out of men's like
Mhm.
sports games at the
Yeah,
and then like see how that would compare and like just like it would make them know the feeling of like people not going to sports games.
Mhm.
I'm not really sure how I feel about it, but I wanted to like keep my project to have something to do with athletics.
yeah.
And that would be communicated through social media, and then also it would be like a protest kind of thing.
Yeah. You know, absence communicates, and I think that in your case, right, I think you have a really good idea about like a specific display or demonstration of that, right? And I think that you know, really highlights, like if you did something like a walkout or like a stage, like almost like boycott of a game, right? That to highlight the lack of participation and representation in women's sports can really help to speak to that problem and sort of raise awareness about it in a way people might not be thinking about, right? There's a lot of ways that we talk a little bit about absence, right? So for instance, to recognize people who have passed away, oftentimes there's like the presence of empty chairs, right? At settings or, you know, a weird example, but several years ago, there was a display where the actor Clint Eastwood was talking to an empty chair because he was like critiquing the absence of, I think he wanted Obama at an event who wasn't there, right? Like, so sometimes we use absence to make an argument and highlight, you know, what's not present that we need to see. So I think that that's a really interesting and effective way that you can kind of focus on that movement and that goal. You can use time of your reflection right up to really talk about the ways that you used absence and that demonstration to bring attention to that issue in a way that otherwise would be paid attention to. Or flipping the script, right? Where you say, well, what if people didn't show up for men's? Really excited to see where that goes. Right.
I'm kind of interested in doing something like regarding mental health for athletes or like mental health for men, because both of these issues are like really serious and like go to like it takes place in a lot of people's lives, but it's not talked about very often, especially with like men's mental health.
Mhm.
And then I said that both these movements would utilize social media as a form of communication, and also like rallies and posters, stuff like that, and then also like the use of narrative. And it would make mostly be about like just bringing awareness to the issue and like breaking the stigma around these topics. And then said that these would be effective in communicating because social media has become a huge source of social movements because it reaches a wide variety of people.
Mhm.
And then like narrative would be effective because sharing personal stories is a great way to have people understand how serious these issues are and like these happen and like
Yeah. The relationship between gender, health, and stigma, I think, is a really important one to situate in context of athletics, right? Not only is mental health crucially important and under-supported issue, but also the ways that in many contexts, right, a lot of, and there's not just one masculinity, there's multiple competing masculinities, right? Different versions of masculinities have different perspectives on mental health and what is considered to be appropriate or okay to disclose and to share, given social stigma and connotation of disclosing mental health diagnosis, right? And there's a lot of stuff that you can draw from there and exploring that, and also just talking about these specific needs that people have, the inability of somebody to feel like they can confidently and comfortably disclose and share challenges and issues with mental health. I think there's a lot that, if you're saying, the use of narrative, storytelling, and disclosure can bring in raising awareness and educating about this. It might be an opportunity to create an opening for an open discussion or sharing, or perhaps even like anonymous stickers or post-it notes on a wall, right, where people are sharing their stories and are able to do so in a way that perhaps is not normal today.
I'm thinking about doing criminal justice reform and focusing more on like the persuasion aspects of the communication. So I would include like narratives, place-based rhetoric, and ethos, logos. And I would focus like mostly on how underprivileged communities should have better access to like mental health resources and stuff to decrease like the need for like that.
Yeah. So criminal justice reform focus on communities and localities in particular. I think invoking things like place and space is a really useful strategy to think about elements of that movement. Right, you might focus on initiatives or projects or efforts that are aimed at a more restorative or rehabilitative justice approach. There's also mentioned in this week's reading, Dwight Conquergood writes a lot about criminal justice system and about the performance of criminal justice in a way that can oftentimes reinforce stigma and violence toward people. So I think really your focus on that topic is really great. I think that the ways that you can bring in some of those elements, especially thinking about locality, space and place, I think are going to be excellent additions there. So really excited to hear about that. And then Angelin, are you with us or able to share anything that you have here?
Yeah, I haven't really decided on like a topic or issue yet, but I think for how this movement will like communicate, I think social media will definitely be one of them. One of the ones that I will like use to communicate about this issue that I choose. And definitely using things like public speeches and like embodiment.
Great. Yeah, I'm excited to see kind of what comes up and where that goes. Again, looking at the combination of social media with embodiment and putting those two things together kind of reflects the reality of a lot of movements that have to negotiate multiple outlets now, right? They have to have probably some type of online presence in this day and age, but the way that they interact with that in face-to-face can definitely vary a lot. So I know we spent a lot of time kind of going over and hearing and talking about your ideas, but I thought it was really useful and good for us to take the time to do that as these ideas develop. One through line I'm noticing in a lot of people's ideas so far is essentially speaking to topics in which populations do not necessarily have the level of agency or support to advocate, or there's something that is getting in the way of somebody's ability to effectively advocate, whether it's the ramifications of sharing and disclosing challenges with mental health, or the challenges associated with discussing the working conditions and labor that they're experiencing. And that's a real challenge, right? The way in which control and power have implicated people's abilities to address and speak to issues, right? We can't assume that everybody has full agency to address an injustice that's impacting them. Gaetari Spivak writes and Candace Subaltern speak about that very idea. We cannot assume that a population has the resources necessary in every instance to speak out, right? We'll be, again, looking at that a bit more next week, including the kind of legal and power-oriented ways that people oftentimes find themselves less able to advocate. And perhaps part of your movement or effort is about empowering or addressing whatever is getting in the way of people's ability to speak and address issues. So really excited to see these ideas develop, and thank you for taking the time to share. So I want to get into a little bit of this. We'll take a break and then pick up on some of this a bit more. But today we're going to be focusing on the other piece from our readings this week, the article from Karma Chavez, talking about counter-public enclaves and understanding the function of rhetoric and social movement coalition building. Again, our focus this week is how people within a coalition or group are communicating as a part of that group and part of that collection, right? So one thing that I think that this reading really brings to the table is that if you are in a protected community or group of people with whom you're able to work together to feel protection and safety, what does that add to our understanding of communication and how communication occurs publicly? And again, I think this helps us to push back against the white men speaking well history of rhetoric, and persuasion and social change communication to instead look at it as it's actually happening. Again, look at 2022 midterms yesterday, many of which are still ongoing, right? Politics is local, and the strategies that are used by smaller coalitions and groups play a really big role here. So for instance, I've been following some of the stuff going on in Nevada, where there's a Senate and governor's race. And one of the big strategies that a lot of smaller groups and coalitions have been using, particularly a culinary workers union in Nevada, has been focusing on door-to-door get out the vote strategies, and has been bragging about how they've knocked on 1 million doors. So the local situated efforts of groups and how groups work together to develop a strategy to reach the public, a lot of that that's going on under the hood is something that is really important to us, but not something that's gained the level of attention that it probably deserves. So essentially, when we think about and when we looked at social movement and counter-public activism, remember that a counter-public is a small group that is created in opposition to a larger public in terms of its ideas or beliefs. So for instance, a counter-public was created among members of the LGBT+ community in response to a lot of legislation that was targeting things like marriage rights. So social movements have generally been analyzed in terms of what we see reaching the larger audience. And that's for a couple of reasons. First of all, because that's what's available to study oftentimes, right? We see the output, but we don't necessarily see how the sausage gets made, right? We don't necessarily see how movements are working within themselves to create the communication that we see reaching the larger audience. Dialectical enjoyment and reciprocity, this idea of engaging in dialogue through public communication or putting out public communication, getting a response. Those have been approaches that we've looked at in the past. This rhetoric of the streets, as we've talked about through Griffin, has been an approach that has looked at this larger effort. But this focus on the behind the scenes activism, what's going on if you actually were a fly in the wall in an organization or group that's pushing toward change. So for instance, right, we have an initiative on campus, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, that is using the red dresses, the variety of forms of advocacy. We see the dresses, we see the posters, we see the events that are being put on, but we're not seeing how those events have taken shape or why these were chosen, right? Those elements that are crucially important to the overall strategy and cohesion of the movements are things that I think could deserve a lot of really good attention and focus. So one idea that I think helps us to inform and understand this a little bit more is this idea of a protected enclave, right? So we can think about an enclave as a distinct social or cultural space that exists within a larger group or society, right? So for example, if we look at the state of Florida, well, the state of Florida has a number of counties and communities that are primarily comprised of Cuban Americans, right? Their ancestry and background has been related to fleeing from Cuba, and that has been a really crucial component, their identity, of their politics, of their perspectives on their existence within this country. And so a lot of the needs and interests of members of these communities might be very culturally or socially distinct. Enclaves can be considered counter-publics, right? So enclaves are able to exist oftentimes in opposition to or in response to the needs of a larger community. But that's not necessarily always the case. It's not always in opposition. An enclave can exist as part of community building and development of a community. And I really like this idea that Chavez brings out, that an enclave is a space for withdrawal. So if you are on the streets, if you're protesting, if you're holding picket signs, right, eventually you're going to wipe yourself out. So there's the social benefit to withdrawing. There is the reinforcement that comes in finding people who are like-minded and share your values and beliefs. But there's also strategy that comes in withdrawal too, right? If, for instance, you have done a protest or you have done a speech or rally or demonstration, and you did not have the turnout you wanted, or your efforts did not have have the outcome that it wanted, right? Say you were having a walkout for a men's sports game, but it didn't get media attention or interest, right? You might be focusing on how you might move forward in response to the changing landscape or world, right? So enclaves create an opportunity for groups to really develop a communication strategy that's responsive to the needs and changes that we see. So according to Chavez, rhetoric is working within enclaves, within these protected groups in two different ways, right? So one of them is the way in which an enclave or protected group is interpreting and making sense of the outside messages that are being created, what those messages mean, and so on. So in other words, an enclave provides an opportunity to take in and use that information in a way that is really useful. So what we'll be looking at are a couple examples discussed in this reading about one group that was about migrant rights, one group that was about LGBTQ protections, and both of those groups were taking a look at legislation in the state of Arizona that was targeting those issues, understanding how that was being framed, and discussing what they could do in response to those messages and how they interpreted perhaps threats or scapegoating on the basis of those messages that they were being given. So how we interpret and make sense of messages is a really important element of this. Again, midterms on the brain, I've been just watching, I watched it for quite a while yesterday, and one thing that a lot of the commentators kept coming back to whenever there was a close race, right? So for instance, the Georgia Senate race is currently headed to a runoff because neither candidate got 50%, was that they would have reporters who were at the campaign headquarters of one of the candidates, and they would ask, well, how is the candidate feeling? What is the energy in the room? What are things looking like, right? And most of the time, it would be something like, oh, well, this candidate's feeling good, or the energy in the room is really exciting, right? There was an event happening, the play out of the election, but that was being understood and interpreted differently on the basis of the beliefs and values of members of that enclave, right? So if somebody was doing a watch party, right, how they interpreted and understood that event was looking a little bit different depending on where they were coming. But the other really key focus here is this idea that an enclave is inventive. It's creating new strategies that are able to challenge oppression or create new opportunities for the group and for the issues that the group has. This desire to bring coalitions in to these topics or issues that are being considered important is a really big strategy that's being used here, right? So in this way, coalitions and enclaves are generative. They create meaning. When ADAPT staged a die-in at the US Capitol, or when ACT UP that we saw last week, right, created those signs that were headstones and they played dead, that's not something that came from one person. That's something that came from group members brainstorming, sitting down and working together. So the ability to invent and create new forms of communication within a group is something that I think is really worth understanding and exploring in a little bit better detail. The last thing I want to hit on before we take a short break is this idea of coalitional subjectivity. So one of the pieces that you've probably seen referenced a lot in the readings in this class is the Gregg piece of the ego function of the rhetoric of protest. And Gregg argues that much of rhetoric and persuasion is about fulfilling our own ego or sense of identity, right? We talked a little bit about that on Monday too, but this idea that, well, rhetoric helps us to create a sense of who we are, and we are a member of this movement. We're part of the movement. Even if you didn't get the change you wanted, you were involved, you held up the sign, you did the thing, right? But Chavez is challenging that a little bit. And the argument is that it's not just about creating your own sense of identity, but that we create an idea called coalitional subjectivity, that a shared sense of identity instead of beliefs is created by members of a group through their participation. Identity does not exist in a vacuum, right? You are not a person on an island who has decided I am XYZ. Our identity is created through a process of relationships with other people. And so creating a shared sense of identity through being a part of a group or enclave is this element that's being seen as really important. As we'll be talking about this idea of scapegoating that was experienced both by migrant and LGBTQ folks in Arizona in the context of legislation that was being proposed in those states, was a way in which coalitional subjectivity was able to emerge, a shared set of experiences or challenges or beliefs or values that shaped how members of that group were able to behave and engage within that broader community. So let's take a break until about 2 o'clock or so. Feel free to use the restroom, get a drink of water. We'll be talking a little bit more about some of the ideas here, as well as performance studies in just a little bit. Okay. Yeah, we'll probably be about them. Otherwise, yes. You're welcome. Yeah, of course. Thank you, Anya.
And then how next week, and then go on. So I'll do.
Okay. So I wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit about performance study, because I think this is an important element of thinking more generally about how coalitions work in this idea of social change. As we've been talking about in the class, right, this element of space, place, performance, spectacle, intersectional communication is a really big element of how movements are choosing to communicate. And so one of the things that's discussed in the Chavez reading is this notion of performance studies, of social performance, as playing a role in shaping what it is that we do, right? So performance studies, we can think about in the context of theater, drama, art, and so on, but it's relevant for us in the context of communication because our performance, our doing of a thing, right, is often making an argument. So our involvement within a coalition or group is part of making that argument using something like spectacle or performance. One example I wanted to share comes from Julie Cosenza, who had a project called Slow, that I think is a really good example here of how the idea of performance and physicality plays a really key role in some of the elements of a communication strategy overall. So Cosenza's project was essentially focused on the ways in which something like a standardized test or just daily functions are not accessible for folks with dyslexia, and was using kind of frame or performance as a way of identifying and recognizing the inaccessibility of a lot of these forms. So, right, in this project, Cosenza is very much juxtaposing a world that requires speed, right? This is timed, get your answer out quickly, and like showing that information displayed, but through physicality, through performance, right? She's visually representing what it might mean to read and understand material as somebody who's dyslexic and might have greater difficulty with accessing and navigating language. So that's an example, right, of using performance as a part of making the argument that performance using bodies and activism to make that point can generate new meaning and ideas that we don't necessarily see just through something that is verbal, spoken, and so on. So performance is at play in our coalitions and our groups that are working on strategies for creating change as well. So the case study that's brought in, right, the specific example of activism explored in the Chavez piece is examining two groups, one of which was known as Wingspan, which I believe shuttered in 2014. The other is CDH. And both of these organizations have similarities and differences. They have coalitions, but they have unique communities that they are working toward and addressing, right? So Chavez did a number of interviews, observations, study within these groups, both of which were based in Tucson, Arizona. And Wingspan was specifically focused on LGBTQ rights and addressing violence impacting LGBTQ communities. For instance, there were a number of folks at Wingspan who were involved with the Trevor Project about LGBTQ rights. And then CDH was an organization based in Tucson as well that was pushing back against militarized border policies and increased military presence at the Arizona border, and also pushing in support of migrant rights, so things such as DREAM Act. So both of these organizations differ in terms of the specific populations that they're trying to reach and the efforts or legislation that they might find themselves advocating about. But in a similar manner to an example from a couple of weeks ago of PISAR, that was a group that was a combination of folks with disabilities and members of the LGBTQ community who were pushing for accessible and safe restrooms. In the same way, these two communities found similarities in the issues and topics and concerns that were coming up within the state and within the initiatives that these groups found themselves pursuing. This connects to a couple of weeks ago, we talked about this idea of analogous arguments, right, of using analogy and comparison as a way in which advocates were able to push toward change. So both of these organizations, both CDH and Wingspan, were concerned with pushing back against two pieces of legislation that were on the docket in the state of Arizona. One was called Protect Arizona Now, and this was legislation that was designed to increase military presence at the border in the state and increase restrictions, including documentation for immigrant status in the state. And so there was kind of pushback against that. And then Protect Marriage Arizona was another piece of legislation that was focused on banning or restricting same-sex marriage in the state. That was in the era before the Obergefell versus Hodges ruling by the US Supreme Court. And while the legislation and topics were certainly different, both Wingspan and CDH found commonalities in terms of how both communities were experiencing and reporting on this idea of scapegoating and targeting on the basis of their identities, right? The idea that there was scapegoating of LGBTQ communities and the idea that they were being targeted from this legislation or being portrayed as a threat to other citizens in the state. And also this idea of scapegoating in the context of migrants, right? And of stereotypes or assumptions made about migrants as well. So while the issues were definitely different, right? There was similarity in terms of how members of the coalitions understood and were reporting on their personal experiences and the ways that they were impacted by some of this discussion and legislation. So kind of given that, I'm going to have us, and we've got a smaller group today, so it'll probably be just 2 or 3 people in each of these groups. So I'm going to be asking us to take some time to look at this Chavez piece. And in particular, the Chavez piece lays out the ways in which these groups were using media, engaging with media, engaging with legislation and policy, and engaging with law enforcement. And what I want you to look at is, first of all, how were they using messages from this site? So for instance, how were they using media, legislation and policy, or law enforcement? So what were the major messages that were coming either through media, through legislation, policy, through law enforcement? What were some of the major messages that are coming through? That should not say major media messages. Sec. So what were the major messages that either came from media, legislation and policy, or law enforcement? What role did enclaves play in responding to either media, legislation and policy, or law enforcement? And how did enclaves develop their own message in engaging with these as well? So so why don't we have, let's do 1 and 2, focused on media. We'll do 1, 2, and 3, focused on legislation and policy. We'll have 1, 2, and 3 focused on law enforcement. So the Chavez piece is split into different sections that are looking at how enclaves were responding to messages from these sites, the way that they responded, and the way that they developed their message. So I'd like you to take some time to explore that within the reading and report back to us on the things that you've noticed there. So have one person write or type for your group. And Angelin, you're welcome to focus on the media section as well and report to us on what you're noticing there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Take a few more minutes to finish up here, and I'll ask groups to share.
Prior to.
Okay. Anybody who would like some more fun? Okay. Yeah, no problem. Go until about 2:30. Okay. How are we doing? Okay, awesome. All right, so let's talk a little bit about this, right? So the enclaves we talked about, the community of activism, we're engaging in terms of media, legislation, policy, and law enforcement. So let's hear from each of the groups in terms of the major messages that were made, the role of enclaves in responding, and how they were able to develop their own message. So let's start here on the media side.
All right, so the major messages that I want to try to media was that the sites kind of like watchdogs, and the fact that they kind of reported and spoke up about the unbiased truth, the bias and the untruthful stuff that was posted when regarding to statistics and strict border patrol. The Newsstand also invested much time in energy issues, monitoring overall.
Mhm.
And then the role that they play is when the opportunity arises, it's media to build connections with the community members,
Mhm.
to connect like-minded similar opportunities.
Yeah, great. So in a lot of ways, the kind of black and white portrayals by media, the skewing and kind of inaccurate representation was something that a lot of communities kind of huddled to discuss and to push back against. What's going wrong here? And how can we push back against the media narrative in order to explain what's going on here, right? So this pushback against an easy, convenient way of characterizing versus a more accurate characterization of migrant LGBTQ issues in the state were one of the ways that the movement was able to boast itself. How about here in the middle? What about legislation and policy?
Okay, so pretty much the CDH and Wingspan use like external rhetoric to justify their need for co-regulation. So pretty much they wanted to create policy like legislation that targeted both queer and migrants.
Mhm.
Pretty much was present of what is absent. But since the issues were not the same, they're pretty similar. It was sorry.
Oh, you're
So
right.
pretty much they were suggesting that whatever issues migrants were dealing with, here were too.
Mhm.
But it was not the same.
Mhm.
So by creating that policy or legislation, it wouldn't have helped either side because since the issues were similar, but they were very different, it would have only affected one side. So that's why they during like election and things like that, and they were talking about issues that were one-sided. So if they talk about one issue, they should talk about the other ones. And being able to differentiate the issues between both parties.
Yeah. So one thing that has increasingly played a role is that a lot of organizations and groups are either consulted or involved in the process of developing legislation. That you have some level of collaboration between lawmakers and groups in either creating or opposing legislation. So when we look at these policies in the state, right, there was this effort to sort of recognize, push back, and characterize what the implications of those policies look like. Because I think, again, a lot of the nuance of policies tend to get lost in media and characterization. So, you know, the movement was able to kind of address some of those elements. And how about here on the end with law enforcement?
Because law enforcement basically portrays like what used to be criminal alignment with criminal behaviors. And on the other hand, law enforcement is also relied on by them to offer protection, so it makes the relationship really hard with each other. And for number two, activists use online sites to invest in political strategy. They publicly challenge offensive rhetoric. And this forms a correlation between queer and migrant rights because a lot of the issues they face are very similar. And number three, law enforcement that messages and abusive harassment to migrant communities. So it sends out the message that basically abusive people are criminals or that they engage in more activities.
And that relationship is, again, a very tense and challenging one, right? Because while there might be requests for protection, there's also kind of pushback and resistance to, and again, we continue to see this now, the relationship between activists and law enforcement is a very contentious spot of discussion. Some people, such as Heyman early in the term said, well, let's have as much law enforcement as possible at these events, just so that we can have this space for people to protest and be active. Other people who have taken a very different approach, right? But the tense relationships that exist there are things that a lot of community members have to grapple with as well. So I think in bringing together some of the things we talked about for today, right? Thinking about protected enclaves and groups such as Wingspan and CDH, we see how communities are able to create a shared sense of identity and community with each other through their membership in these organizations. But how enclaves are able to create a sense of shared experience and some of the challenges that might be faced as a part of being involved in these groups. So we'll meet again next Monday. Remember that Friday is Labor Day, so if you have classes on Friday, they will not be meeting. So next week, we'll be looking at strategies of control and constraint of social movements. I'll have the rubric for creative movement presentations up later today. Please pass forward or email me your attendance if you haven't done so already. Have a great long weekend. Canvas prompt is available for the Sunday, and I will see you again next week.